Recompense have come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The man of the Spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God. Yet a fowler's snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. They have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season, I saw your fathers, but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable like the thing they loved. Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, I will bereave them till none is left. Woe to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. Give them, O Lord, what you will. Give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Every evil of theirs is in Gilgal. There I begin to hate them. Because of the wickedness of their deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more, and their princes are rebels. Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Even though they give birth, I will put their beloved children to death. My God will reject them, because they have not listened to him. They shall be wanderers among the nations. Well, to answer the question, what will it be like when God's people choose to live without God? Obviously, nothing good, right? There's not going to be anything good that happens. And one of the things you want to just pay close attention to, you shouldn't have too much difficulty picking up on it, but the emphasis is on the fact that this is God's people. And that's what we have to keep remembering, that God's people do well because of God. And I'm going to differentiate between us as the people of God and Israel. Okay, we are chosen in a different sense than the nation of Israel, than God's people, and God's people, Israel, and we're going to talk about even to today. They continue to exist not because of themselves, but because of God. And so God is the one. So without God, Israel, his people, are really nothing. So first question that we would ask to help us out to understand what it will be like when God's people choose to live without God, we could ask the question, well, what will happen since you abandon God? What will happen since you abandon God? And we find at the very beginning, don't get excited, don't rejoice. Why? Because you have run out of resources, basically, is one of the things that's going to happen. If you look at verse 2, threshing floor and wine vat shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail them. They're not going to get the new wine, that's the new harvest. The next harvest isn't going to happen, and the harvest that already happened of the grain, which would be the threshing floor, and of the grapes, which would be the wine vat, that harvest is not sufficient to supply their need, and they're not going to see another harvest. So because they've abandoned God, because they've turned their backs on God, they're going to run out of resources. But we see in verse 3 that they're also going to be carried off into bondage. They will not remain in the land of the Lord. They're going to be carried away. Ephraim shall return to Egypt. And again, not necessarily is he saying Egypt proper, but Egypt as a symbol of bondage in some ways. Certainly as the northern kingdom kind of dispersed and people ran for their lives, yeah, I'm sure some probably went south down to the area of Egypt. And so that'll come into play a little bit later in this text. But the picture of bondage, that's what he's really saying here. When you abandon God, because you've abandoned God, you're being carried away into bondage. Now, Assyria is actually the place of exile. So you see that at the end of verse 3. They shall eat unclean food in Assyria. That's where they're going to end up in bondage. And basically, without God's help for Israel, without God's help, the crops are going to fail. Without God's help, they cannot remain in the land without God. They have to have God in order to do that. And again, I want you to think along the lines of God told Abraham from the beginning. He says, I am going to take you to a land that you do not know, right? And then when he takes them to the land of Canaan, I'm going to give you this land as your possession and for your heritage. Then when God's people come back into the land after wandering around in the wilderness, and they finally come in to take the land, God promises them that He will supply their food. He will supply their drink. He will supply their every need as long as they faithfully follow Him. But they've not been doing that. They've abandoned Him, and since they've abandoned Him, guess what is going to happen? They are not going to be able to stay in the land. And they're not going to have sufficient crops and food in order to support them. As we look into verse 4, another thing that happens because they've abandoned God, he says, they shall not pour out drink offerings of wine to the Lord, and their sacrifices shall not please Him. So it also affects their sacrifices. They're going to offer, basically, he says, defiling sacrifices. It's like mourner's bread, he says. All who eat of it shall be defiled. The bread for the mourner's bread, it was always unclean. Because the mourners, and we know kind of in that culture, they would actually hire people to do some of the mourning, the wailing and all that kind of stuff. They would come in contact with the body, and so they would be unclean. So the bread that they would eat would be unclean. And he says, what you're doing, what you're offering to me, you think you're offering these sacrifices to me, but because you've abandoned me, it's defiled. It's a defiled sacrifice. It has no value. Well, he says their bread shall be for their hunger. I mean, you can eat it. That's all it's good for. It's not good. It's not good for a sacrifice. It's not good for an offering. I'm not going to receive it in that way because you have abandoned me. He says there in verse 5, what are you going to do on the day of the appointed festival? What are you going to do on the day of the feast, on these feast days and these festival days? He says, what are you going to do? And here's the problem. Remember what he said in verse 3? You're exiled. You're eating in the land of Assyria. What good is it to celebrate the festivals of God in a land that is not the land that God has given to His people? And he's just basically saying there's no value in it. There's nothing that comes of you celebrating these festivals and these feast days in another land, mainly because they can't do it the way that God said they ought to observe these special days. So what's happening here is, again, they're running out of resources because they've abandoned God. They're going to be carried away into bondage because they've abandoned God. Their sacrifices are defiled because they're abandoning God. And then it kind of comes to the culmination in verse 6. Behold, they are going away from destruction. So the people scatter from the northern kingdom because Assyria is coming in to destroy it, right? So they scatter. They're running from destruction, but what's going to happen? He says Egypt will gather them. Okay, there's going to be a place that they're going to go, but Memphis shall bury them. The city of Memphis in Egypt is a well-known or a famous burial ground. All he's saying is because you have abandoned God, you're going to be removed from the land and never return. You're going to die removed from the land. It just talks about the permanence of their exile, the fact that the northern kingdom is not again going to return and take the land or possess the land. So this first question, what's going to happen since you've abandoned God? You're going to run out of resources. You're going to be carried away into bondage. Your sacrifices are defiled, and you're going to ultimately die in a foreign land. Nothing good will happen because you've abandoned God. Good grief. It happens. Too many other things going on, right? How will you hear? The next question that we have is how will you hear from God without God? If you don't have God, how are you going to hear from God? Look at verse 7. The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. And then this next statement, the prophet is a fool. The man of the Spirit is mad because of your great iniquity and great hatred. Prophets in the Old Testament, well, I guess we could say in the New Testament as well, because Jesus was a prophet and John the Baptist was a prophet. Prophets were the mouthpiece of God. We think about it mostly in the Old Testament because that's where we see most of the prophets. But as we think to the Old Testament, so much of what we have as biblical revelation, right, special revelation from God, it came from those people. So yeah, they had the Pentateuch, right? They had the first 5 books, the books of the law. But as God was revealing His truth, even what we're reading here in Hosea, the people are hearing it from the prophets. They're hearing it from the mouth of the prophets, not like we're able to just open it up and read it all, in one sitting. So Hosea says, you're basically, you consider the prophets to be insane, right? That's what he says. He says, you say that the prophet is a fool. You say the man of the Spirit is mad or insane. Why? Well, look at the second part of that verse. Because your great iniquity and your great hatred. Why did the people think the prophets were crazy? Because they were not the prophets, but the people were sinful, okay, full of iniquity, and they were full of hatred. The people, because of their sin, didn't want to hear the prophets. I mean, it's like if you ever talk to anybody who's indulging in sin, when they're in that phase of indulgence and they're really enjoying themselves, and you try to tell them that they're doing the wrong thing, they don't want to hear from you. And they'll probably lash out at you, or they'll cut you off, and they'll be angry at you. And so that's what the people were doing. When the prophets of God would come along, they would, because they were so sinful, because they were filled with iniquity, they would act in hatred toward the prophets of God. So what they're essentially doing is the people are cutting off God's communication to them. I mean, that's the question. I mean, how are you going to hear from God if you won't listen to God's messengers, right? It would be like you and I say, hey, I want to hear from God. I want to hear from God. I want to know what God thinks. I want to know how God feels. I want to know what God wants me to do, and we never open our Bible. Somebody says, well, why don't you open up your Bible and read it? No, I can't stand the Bible. Oh, it's just all that old, Well, you're cutting off the communication from God to us, and that's what the people were doing in that day. They were cutting off that line of communication. God sends the prophets. If you look at verse 8, the prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God. God, if you will, working together with the prophets that He sends. The prophets are the watchmen, and the watchmen, their job was to look from the city, right? They were to look from the city for the enemy, and when they see the enemy coming, they were supposed to alert the city to the danger that was coming, right? Well, the prophets, that's what God would do. God had sent prophet after prophet after prophet to the northern kingdom and said, hey, you're sinning, you're doing the wrong thing, you need to do this, you need to change the way that you're doing things. The watchmen had come. The watchmen had given their warnings. They were working, he says here, they were working together with God, yet, in verse 8, a fowler's snare is on all his ways. In other words, every time these prophets of God, these watchmen, would try to proclaim the warning of the danger and the change that needed to take place, there was a trap. And a lot of times that trap ended in the death of the prophet, because that's what God's people would do. They would kill the prophets. He goes on, he says, the fowler's snare is on all his ways, and hatred is in the house of his God. I think, and let me put it this way. I'll say maybe what this is indicating when he says that hatred is in the house of his God, the his being the prophet. So hatred is in the house of the prophet's God, so the God that the prophet is serving. What would that be representing? Well, I think it's representing the religious leadership. In the house of God, where there should be faithful priests, right? Instead, there is hatred there. Hatred by those religious leaders against the prophet that God is sending. Why? Because the prophet of God often spoke against the sins of the priests, called them out. Hosea has already done that. He's already called the priests out on a couple of occasions about their sin, how they're leading the people astray spiritually. So that's where I think the hatred that's in the house of God, it's actually from those religious leaders. There is deep corruption. If you look further in verse 9, they have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. If you were to read Judges chapter 19 and Judges chapter 20, you would come across one of those stories, one of those biblical accounts that many people who want to discredit the Bible or speak very negatively about the Bible, this is one of those accounts that they might use because a very vile and heinous event took place. There's an individual who comes into the land of Gibeah. He is actually a Levite. He has a concubine with him. And in the night in the city that he ends up in, kind of similar to the Lot biblical account where, the men of the city come to get those two angels that have come. Well, the men of this city, they come to there was somebody who invited the Levite into his house, basically because he knew what was going to happen if he didn't. And in the night, the men of the city come, and that's what they want. They want this man to be delivered up to them so that they can have their way with him. And instead of doing that, they actually put out to the people the concubine of this Levite. Again, we have to be careful about justifying things, if you will, or what exactly is going on here. We don't know exactly how all this played out, but basically what happens is that she is sexually violated throughout the night and basically left for dead, and she dies. And what happens is the Levite takes her home and literally divides her up into 12 pieces, her body, and sends those pieces, one piece to each of the tribes of Israel, and basically says, hey, you guys better do something, or we're going to have some trouble, right? And so a large army is amassed, and that army ends up going against the Gibeonites, and it also ends up going against Benjamin, because the tribe of Benjamin will not join to see justice done and to deal with this the proper way. And so there is basically it's tough to call it a civil war. It's a couple civil battles between the Israelites. Thousands and thousands of people lose their lives in the process. If you look at that, but it's that event. So that's what Hosea is saying. It's so bad. It's like this most heinous crime, this terrible event in the history of our people. It's like that. That's how bad the situation has gotten here. And he says he will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. Basically, how will you hear from God without God? If you reject the prophets of God, how can you possibly hear from God? Really, to be faithful to God, for God's people to be faithful to Him, it requires that we hear, or that they hear from God. And these people were saying, no, we don't want to hear from God. Again, they've abandoned God. And this is what happens when they abandon God, is there is judgment that is going to come as a result of that. The next question, how will you hope for a future without God? How will you hope for a future without God? Make sure the comma's in there, otherwise it says something different. But how will you hope for a future without God? If you abandon God, how can you possibly hope for a future? Hosea begins in verse 10, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. So this is God speaking, like grapes in the wilderness. If you are in the wilderness, you're kind of in the middle of nowhere, right? And if you happen to come along across some food in the wilderness, that's a bonus. You take advantage of that. It's a refreshing sight. It's a wonderful thing. And God says, when I came across Israel, it was like grapes in the wilderness. So we need to go back to thinking about Abraham, if you will, in the wilderness of the world. And all the people in the world, and all around the world at the time of Abraham, God, as he's walking through the wilderness, he comes across this man, right? and he chooses Abraham. He says, this is the guy. This is the grapes in the wilderness. This is the bonus. This is what I'm looking for. And he chooses Abraham. And then he goes on and he talks about the first fruit of the fig tree. It says, in its first season. If you think about the nation of Israel, when was it really a nation? Like first, a nation, if you will, set apart by God. And it's right after they came out of Egypt, right? I mean, they were in bondage for 400 years, but they didn't really have, they had their own identity, but their identity was as slaves, right? They weren't really the first fruits of God's people. They weren't really, if you will, his until he pulled them out of their bondage and out of slavery. And so he's saying, look, this is special. This is, I chose you. I pulled you out to be mine. I harvested, if you will. And then there's that word that we don't often like to see in the middle of verse 10, but. He says, I chose you. I brought you to myself. I gathered you. I saw your fathers. The sense is I saw with affection. But what happened? But they came to Baal Peor. Rather than going to God, God's the one who called them. God's the one who identified them. God's the one who claimed them. Rather than going to God, they went to, it says, Baal Peor, and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable in the thing that they loved. Baal Peor was the fertility god of the Moabites and the Midianites. We could go back to Numbers chapter 25 and see this event where, again, the people of God, though he had called them out of Egypt, they decided that they were going to go after these other gods, these fertility gods. And actually, that's very important to this section when we talk about the future of God's people. What are the results of trusting their future posterity, right? Again, it's a fertility god. So God's people are going to the fertility god of another nation, basically wanting to be fertile and produce a posterity. Well, what happens when you do that? God says, if you look at the end of verse 11, no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. God does this miraculous thing time and time again in the Scripture, opening the wombs of women who are unable to have children. Guess what that means? He can also reverse the process, right? And so these people, he's saying, I am going to basically put an end to the fertility. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. If they have children in verse 12, they will not survive. In verse 14, he says, miscarrying wombs and dry breasts. There's no children to nurse. God is the one, think about this. Fertility, right? Why would God's people go after a fertility god of another nation when the founder, the father of their people, Abraham, when God is the one who supplied a son to Abraham? When God is the one who supplied a son to Isaac? When God is the one who supplied 12 sons to Jacob? Do we need another fertility god? I mean, I think the one you've got is pretty good. And then by the time they're coming out of Egypt, this massive, huge nation, they're saying estimates of 2 million people coming out of Egypt. Meanwhile, I guess we kind of skipped over the fact that Pharaoh said, hey, we're going to kill all the male children, and that didn't even happen, right? Because we got Moses that comes out of that. I think God does a pretty good job on the fertility side of things. I think he's proved it over and over and over again. But these people said, we're going to go this direction. And so the punishment is that they are going to be without children. Without God, think about this. What God is basically saying to the northern kingdom is that you are not going to be able to sustain your existence, right? population. If you're not replacing the dying ones, then without God, they can't do that. And I'll emphasize again, every step of this, each of these questions is, the problem is that they're trying to do something without God that God has promised He will do to keep them around. And I'm specifically speaking to Israel as a nation. So the northern kingdom, because they've abandoned God, we already said they're going to be exiled, never to return. They're going to die in foreign lands, right? But there's another part of this nation that God continues to preserve. And we find out that God continues to preserve that part of the nation, the southern kingdom of Judah, really only because of the promise that He made to David. Right? That's it. So it's not even because the southern kingdom was a better group of people. I mean, they had a few good kings, but congratulations, you were still just as rotten as the northern kingdom. All the same sins. God preserved this nation because God chose to preserve the nation. In other words, if you take God out of the equation, the nation falls. It's as simple as that for Israel, for God's people. Even today, Israel as a nation, it's not hard to go back and look at certain events in, very recent history, right? Late 40s, late 1940s, excuse me. We have to say 19 now. The things, the ways or the things that Israel has survived, right? The opponents, the enemies that continue to mount up and rise up against Israel, and the fact that they've survived, or the fact that they've thrived in a lot of ways. You and I need to understand. Israel may not understand it. As a nation, they may not get it. But it's only because God has not abandoned the nation of Israel. And I'm talking about today. That's the only reason. Because very simply, if God abandoned the nation of Israel, like He did here in the northern kingdom, they'd be gone in a heartbeat. Because they can't sustain themselves. I mean, they think that they can, I get it. But literally, they can't sustain themselves without God's help, because this nation, we have to understand, Israel's a unique nation. If we want to call ourselves one nation under God or whatever, fine, we could say that. But it's not the same as Israel. Israel as a nation came into existence because of God, remained in existence because of God, and is still a nation today only because of God. Nothing else. Only because of God. Lastly here, this last question, how will you survive alone without God? How will you survive alone without God? Yeah, I know we've talked about abandoning already, but this is a little bit more specific. If you look at verse 15, the middle of the verse, because of the wickedness of their deeds, I will drive them out of my house. So let's go back to the marriage analogy. God has chosen His people, right? Married them, joined with His people in marriage. They were unfaithful. God called them back. But the northern kingdom has persisted in their spiritual adultery to the point where God says, you know what? That's it. This marriage is over. Okay? The relationship that God has with the northern kingdom is over, and He says, I'm going to remove you from my house. And that's part of the exile, right? That symbolism or that picture of the exile. I'm going to remove you from my house. How do you survive when you are no longer in relationship with God? He says here, I will put their beloved children to death. My God will reject them. He said, verse 15, I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. Yikes. I will love them no more. What do you do? We've already talked about the fact that without God, their posterity, their future, what future do they have without God? They've got no future because God causes the wombs to dry up, right? There's no children. There's no future. There's no posterity. And he emphasizes that again, even though they give birth in verse 16, I will put their beloved children to death. My God will reject them. If you look here, he says, because they've not listened to him, they shall be wanderers among the nations. That's kind of like a final declaration. You're going to be, I'm going to kick you out of my house, and you're just going to kind of wander through the world. And the Israelites, the Jews from the northern kingdom that happened to survive when Assyria comes in, they would be dispersed and scattered all over the place, and eventually no longer really recognizable as Israelites anymore. They've intermingled, they've intermarried with the other nations around them, and so that's what God is describing here, that they will be wanderers among the nations. Without God, Israel cannot remain as a nation. When we think about, and we're going to try to draw some application here, this is really just emphasizing what happens because Israel has rejected God and they've abandoned God. They've basically got no leg to stand on. There's nothing to support them, and they're just going to fall apart. We could kind of summarize it with this. When you abandon God, things always get worse, right? When you abandon God, things always get worse. Even if there's, it seems like they're getting better. Some people, they struggle with the Christian life, and so they're like, I'm going to choose another route, and seems like it's easier for a while, but that catches up to you. When you abandon God, things always get worse. When you abandon God, you can't hear from God. That's what's happened to the people of Israel. That's what's happened to them. When you abandon God, you can't hear from God. When you abandon God, you can't really hope for the future. An important part of that is that the future belongs to God. I mean, who's got the plan for the future? God does. Whose plan is going to work out for the future? God's plan or my plan? Well, God's plan, right? Mine's only going to work out if my plan agrees with what God says. So this idea of, I've got hope for the future because I'm doing this or I'm doing that, or I'm going to try this thing, or I'm going to try that thing. There's no hope in that future if we abandon God. Because God and His plan for the future is what's actually going to happen. When you abandon God, you're choosing to try to survive alone, to only trust yourself for survival. Do you want to be in a position where God says, I'm kicking you out of my house, I don't love you anymore? Well, of course not, because then you're on your own. But there are people who, in that sense, abandon God, and I don't think that any of this is applying, or I'm trying to apply it in the sense of, somebody's gonna, they abandon God and lose their salvation, or that sort of thing. Because what's happened in Israel, it's a rejection of God, and it's a full separation. Okay, these are not people that are going to be redeemed again. Okay. I don't want you to even think nowadays of just a wayward Christian or a believer who's gotten into, we're not talking about that at all. When there's an abandonment of God, again, things get worse. You can't hear from God. You can't really hope for the future. If you're trying to think about our nation right now, which I'm sure some of you are, if you're trying to think about our nation, we just need to be thinking about those who are not believers, okay? I'm not talking about Christians who do this. I'm talking about the unbelievers. There's the same abandonment of God, right? They know that God exists. They know that God is, but they've abandoned God. We can do this on our own, right? We're gonna abandon God, so we're trying to survive alone. I mean, this nation, how great are we doing surviving on our own? Yeah, okay? And no nation has ever done very well trying to survive on their own. Hope for the future. What hope do we have for the future as far as our country is concerned? Well, there's great concern for our country because of the direction that we're going, right? There's a great deal of uncertainty in our future as a nation. But this is what's happening because our nation as a whole, we might say, is abandoning God. So if you want to draw some parallels there, you can do it in that way. But don't confuse this with maybe we're talking about Christians who are not being faithful to God or Christians who are abandoning God. I don't want us to get the idea that that's a normal thing, number one, or that certainly even if a believer is living in sin, trying to live independently of God, it still never gets to the point of the abandonment that God shows to his people here. And I would suggest the same abandonment that's eventually going to happen to our nation. There's going to be a full abandonment by God of our nation because of the rejection of our nation of God. So those are maybe some of the parallels if we're going to draw any of those. But what we mainly want to see is that without God, the nation can't stand. Israel cannot remain. What they didn't realize, what they didn't acknowledge was that their very existence was because of God. They thought they had something to do with it. They thought the nations around could help with that. They didn't acknowledge God as the source of their existence. I mean, their very existence. So that's kind of where they are in this whole, if you will, the punishment phase that God is laying out for them, just what judgment is going to come. Comments, questions, thoughts? Yes, Gary? Well, that's a totally separate, that's a totally unique situation. But you're talking about the southern kingdom. Right. Well, I'm not sure. Sure. Wasn't there a time in history where the thoughts and the intents of the hearts of man were only evil continually? Is it possible for a whole culture to totally abandon God? Is it possible for the whole northern kingdom? I mean, we have to ask the question, well, why is destruction taking place, right? I believe that the reason that the United States of America is still around is because of the faithful people in the nation. I believe that God's preserving the nation because of them. But I also think that there's coming a time where they're maybe not going to be here anymore. We're talking about from right now, from one generation to the next, where there is a total abandonment of faith, right? So don't try to convince me that 50 years from now, there's still going to be some religious people here, because I'm not 100% sure of that. Well, I can't, no. So I can't say for sure. And I would say, just like you can't say for sure that there probably were, we don't know for sure, but there's no indication whatsoever, and there doesn't have to be. So that's the difference. When you talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you talk about Daniel, in the southern kingdom, there has to be faithful people in the southern kingdom, because God always promises to preserve a remnant, and the remnant are always faithful to God. So if God's... What's that? Well, correct, but and again, those are kind of the asides. The fact is that the reason there was faithful people in the southern kingdom is because, again, that's part of God's plan. And so the reason that the southern kingdom was preserved is because God's plan, obviously, but he preserved the nation through those faithful people. The northern kingdom, the fact that they're being totally dispersed and destroyed, basically there's no reason that we have to think that any of those people were faithful to God. Remember, the problem in the northern kingdom is that all their worship was messed up to begin with. because they're not going to Jerusalem to the temple where God says to worship to begin with. They're going to these other places like Dan and Bethel where there's different idols that are set up. And so, yeah, I don't really have any reason to believe that anyone in the northern kingdom, other than the prophets that came from time to time, with the northern kingdom, like their existence. I'm not 100. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it was always bad kings, and so there was never any, if you will, revival or any positive there. So while we could, like I said, it's speculation either way. To say, well, there could have been some, or even to say there definitely weren't. We can't say for sure either way. But I would personally, I would just lean toward the sense or the idea that there's a good chance there weren't any, because of the wholesale destruction of the people. I mean, if it was one of those things, it might have been, let's say, maybe the faithful, if there were, maybe early on in the divided kingdom, there was some that were in the northern kingdom that were like, hey, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, right? Where? Not that I know of. I mean, it just says that they were going to be dispersed. Assyria carried off some of them. The rest of them kind of ran for their lives. So different nations. That was kind of a replacement strategy that Assyria and Babylon would use in a lot of these places. Is when they conquered one place, they would bring in people, maybe even from another place that they had conquered, and kind of relocate them so that it wasn't, it was a fresh group of people in the land and different from the ones that had been there to begin with. That kind of helped them to really to push their culture into that area rather than leaving people in the place where was their homeland. So it was kind of a strategy that was often used back in that day with like I said, with Assyria and with Babylon. But well, in the day of Jesus, that's what the Samaritans were. They were some kind of a half breed or part breed Jew, but like I said, it was basically unrecognizable. There was no connection as far as the Jews and Samaritans were concerned. They weren't they weren't connected. They hated each other. So yeah, just because they were in the land doesn't mean they had been there the whole time. Even yeah, no, no. No, yeah, but that's so Nazareth was north of Samaria. So there's like where Jerusalem was, then there was Samaria, and then north of Samaria. So it was, yeah, yeah, he wasn't. Yep. Oh, dinner is served. All right. Yep, Jeff. Uh, you mean at the beginning, like after? I thought what I was going to come back to was the necessity of God, um, the fact that God has chosen Israel was the thing that made it unique. Yeah, there wasn't a comparison between believers today with that comment. I don't think. I was just saying that the necessity for Israel's survival, that God is the one who chose them, right? So everything that they did, their survival, their well-being, totally depended on God. I think that was what I was going to reference back to. I don't know. I could be wrong, but others? Anybody else? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right, exactly. So any that may have been left behind, it's not like they were faithful Jews to begin with as far as their practice of religion. So um, for those that were exiled and whatever, it just became a matter of survival and do what you got to do to survive. Hmm. Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, it's, like I said, that's another reason why I think that there may not have been any, because there was plenty of time to bail out, to leave. Right. Yeah. If there's any left, right? So, I mean, I think that that's part of Jesus' parable when he talks about the leaven, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. When he talks about the birds that are in the tree, when he talks about those parables, I believe that those parables actually represent that someday there will be the leaven. Like I said, a little bit leavens the whole lump. That the sin, as it gets into the church, even that eventually it's going to be so thoroughly permeating the church that the church will no longer be made up of believers, or churches in America, for example, will no longer be made up of believers, which is a very real possibility, considering that in a lot of churches in America, there's probably not very many believers at all. Some of these churches, and so I think a day is coming, and that will be. I think you're right in that God, in one way or another, spares the faithful, either through death, right, or somehow pulling them out of that. But I think and it won't take too long before there's a very small group of faithful people, and quite honestly, if let's say that the church in America, became somehow a state-run church, right? And like it was in maybe World War II Germany, and the state-run church, so the state controls everything. Well, for you and for me, if the state's controlling the church, we're not going to go to the church, right? Because it's not really the church anymore. We're going to have separate meetings in different places, and so someday the church won't be the church that you and I think of, because it's going to be filled with unbelievers, and that's just the way that our culture is going to go, I think. But anyway, we'll find out. Yes, or maybe we won't. That'd be even better, wouldn't it?